tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much. I suppose I could say by the fact that I'm really very fortunate to be living in Southern Africa, especially South Africa at this point in time. And after writing Slate Species of God in 2006, my journey of discovery and exploration into the origins of humankind has taken me down some very interesting paths and led me to meet a chap called Johann Heine, who made the phenomenal discovery of Adam's calendar, which, well, at that stage it didn't have a name. It was just a calendar site. But basically, the fact that I wrote a book called Slave Species of God allowed me to then move into further discovery and research and meet some amazing individuals here in South Africa that have been making observations for a long time of mysterious ancient stone circular structures and ruins that have been missed and completely misinterpreted by historians and archaeologists, and allowed us to go in there and reevaluate and reassess their importance and significance in human history, only to discover that we're dealing with what we now believe is the first civilization on Earth, and the first time that we actually present the physical evidence of this first civilization, this vanished civilization that lived at the bottom southern tip of Africa, mining gold. And this would be the civilization that people like Zecharia Sitchin and many others have been writing about and referring to in their translations of the Sumerian tablets. And I suppose I'm very fortunate that we are now dealing with these vast numbers of ancient stone ruins that take us back just short of 300,000 years and exposing this ancient civilization that just suddenly and mysteriously vanished around 13,000 years ago. And that's what we're dealing with at the moment. And I suppose I'm working on that on a daily basis.
Wow. So do you find much opposition from like mainstay science when you try to present this case?
Not really. That's the interesting thing. I've got to first distinguish between science and archaeology. And I need to do this because I think it's important just to put things into perspective. Scientists as a whole, physicists, astrophysicists, chemists, geologists, people who studied scientific principles or have some sort of a scientific background have absolutely no problem with any of these discoveries. In fact, they're the guys that are really supporting my work on all kinds of possible levels, even astrophysicists and nuclear physicists and some of the leading experts in their field here in South Africa. Where the opposition comes from is from the archaeological fraternity. And I must quickly haste to say that archaeology sort of falls between the cracks, and it's not really regarded as a scientific principle. We're not quite sure where to put it, or not we, I suppose the establishment is not quite sure where to put it. So I'd like to separate the scientists from the archaeologists and leave it as that. The archaeologists are the guys that are really struggling with some of the discoveries. They seem to live in textbooks and they don't want to get out of the textbooks. Yeah.
I see. So what is your perspective of human existence or evolution now that you've been enlightened, per se?
Well, Joe, the situation is really straightforward. I mean, there are those scholars and academics who are prepared to break the mold and come out and share their findings and tell it like it is. And then there are those that are too scared to call it as it is because they're scared to lose their job, they're scared of being ridiculed by their peers, and they're just fearful. Fortunately, I don't fall into any kind of institutional fold, and I can say what I need to say as I discover it, and I'm not guided by any of these principles. So I'm lucky as far as that goes. I'm a completely independent researcher and scientist, and my observations are very simple. There's overwhelming evidence that the human race is a product of some cloning or genetic manipulation of something of that nature. that we suddenly appeared on planet Earth about 300,000 years ago as a result of this cloning and manipulation, genetic manipulation. And there was a very simple reason why we appeared on this Earth. We were created as a slave species to some higher, more advanced beings to mine gold. And planet Earth has been a mining colony for a long time. It remains a mining colony today. And that's what it started like. And the evidence for this genetic manipulation far outweighs any other evidence of the so-called theory of evolution. Okay, and this is where the two areas cross over quite comfortably, because there's plenty of evidence for evolution when we look at plant species, when we look at other animals and things around us. But at the same time, there is absolutely overwhelming evidence that there is something wrong with our DNA. And the fact that we only use 3% of our DNA, less than any other species on this planet, speaks volumes of the fact that we're supposed to be the most advanced and civilized creature on this planet, and yet we use so little of our DNA. Something is wrong with that model. It doesn't quite fit. Oh. So that's where my belief structure lies at the moment.
Okay. So how do you think that this would change the various religions in the world if this came out as kind of like the smoking gun per se, and it actually proved what you say?
Well, you've got to go back and look where the origins of religions are. And origins of religions, if you actually go back, and this is what I show in my first book, Slave Species of God, every single religion on earth has its origins in ancient civilizations and goes back and can be traced back to the same group of so-called gods, these mythological gods that were present on planet Earth for many thousands of years and manipulated and enslaved the people for a very long time. And every religion comes from the same, exactly the same area. At the source and the beginning of every religion, there is always the presence of these so-called gods.
Right.
And you've got to start breaking and separating our understanding of God with a big G, the divine being, the divine creative spirit, the divine creative source and energy for all the things in the universe, and just advanced beings who declare themselves gods above the humans because they could fly in machines and genetically manipulate species. And so there's a big difference between God with a big G and God with a small G, and we should never ever confuse the two.
Right. Okay, so do you want to go into the various books that you've written or a website that you'd like to tell the listeners? Like, how can they find more about you?
Look, there are a number of websites. The first website would be slavespecies.com. And you can also subscribe to my newsletters there. I write the regular articles that go out to people that subscribe, and I try and keep up with the latest discoveries and link it to this, what I call the great human puzzle. And then there's also zuluplanet.com. That's ZULU planet, zuluplanet.com. And then also the website for our foundation, the foundation that we created in 2003 to protect and preserve these ancient stone ruins in South Africa, and hopefully preserve them for sharing this information and being able to show them off to tourists and people that come visit. And that is the Makomati Foundation, and that's MAKOMATI.org, makomati.org.
Great. So how long would you say you've been doing this type of work?
Joe, I've been interested in the origins of humankind since very early in my life, in my early teens and even before that. I was just fascinated by these mythological stories of these all-powerful gods that were present on Earth in ancient times, that were flying around in these incredible machines that could do all these amazing things, and they were all part of this big family, and they had complete control of the earthlings, and And I was absolutely fascinated by that. And at that stage, I was a young, aspiring musician, and I would write songs about every single one of these mythological gods, from Zeus to Mercury to Beelzebub to Pluto to you name it. I wrote songs about these characters, and I suppose that's why I started really being interested in what on earth was going on all these thousands of years ago on planet Earth. And what I need to share with your audience is this whole thing of mythology. It's very important to break down some of these words and these terminologies that we use every now and then. Well, actually, that we use all the time, every day, like the word mythology. For example, the origin of the word mythology comes from Greek, mythos, and in the original meaning, it means completely the opposite to the value that we ascribe to it today. Today, we believe that mythological means imaginary, fairy tale stories, etc. Well, that is not true. Actually, the original meaning of mythos was words, written words and spoken words of historic events that were sworn to be true by priests and kings. So suddenly you see what happens is that we take what ancient civilizations saw as absolutely part and parcel of their history and irrefutable, deniable facts, and we completely distort its meaning. Because today, when you say mythological, everybody thinks imaginary and so forth.
Right.
So what I'd like to tell your listeners is to say, next time you read the word mythological, just replace it with the word historical, because that's what it is, and suddenly you realize that our human history looks completely different. And that's an exciting discovery to make. Remember that these stories of these mythological creatures don't just come from, Greece and Egypt and so forth, but we read about the same group of gods in the Sumerian tablets, the oldest written record of human history we have on Earth. And in these Sumerian tablets, we read about these gods that came to Earth and created the earthlings in their own image to work as slaves in the gold mines, and that exact same story gets repeated in every ancient civilization and culture. In the Zulu culture, the South African Bantu tribal, the indigenous people, the Zulu people culture, they talk about the Abalungu, the white sky gods that came down from the sky and created the black people, or the African people, should I say, because they weren't black at that stage. The Sumerian tablets describes them very clearly as to what the first earthlings looked like. They were quite reddish in their appearance and their skin, and so the white sky gods came out of the sky and created the earthlings to work in the gold mines. And this is not something that you make up and throw out freely, because you'd be classed as a racist quite easily. But this isn't something I'll make up. This is something that's well entrenched in African tradition, African religion, and African customs, ancient customs. And we need to start embracing this information and stop shoving it under the carpet and turning a blind eye to this.
Right. So things such as Atlantis, I know a lot of the listeners have heard of Atlantis. So just for an example, that's considered to be mythical. What are your views on that in that era of human history?
Atlantis was most certainly not a mythical place. Atlantis definitely existed. There's no question about that. We're seeing strange geophysical phenomena going on today on planet Earth. We see tsunamis come and go, wiping out coastlines, coastal cities, taking out small islands, and these are just tiny, tiny little tsunamis, right? This is not major geophysical disasters. Now imagine a flood so vast that it covered the entire world with a wave several kilometers or several miles high. It's not something we can imagine. It's just way outside of our spectrum of imaginary ability at the moment.
Right.
So Atlantis is something that's written about in all ancient civilizations. I mean, they talk about this place. The ancient Greeks and ancient well-known, recognized and revered writers and historians talk about Atlantis and so forth. And then we come along and say, no, these guys are talking rubbish. They were taking too many drugs or getting drunk or something like that, you know?
Right.
Because we can't understand how all this ancient stuff could have happened, and yet we don't know about it today.
Right.
And it's our arrogance and our ego that keeps kicking in, and we think we're so smart because we believe we're the pinnacle of civilization,
right,
and knowledge and sophistication just because we've got cell phones or something stupid like that. It's just absolutely pathetic, and we've got to wake up, smell the coffee, and realize that things were completely different in years gone by, that there's a history on this planet that is so removed from our ability to try and actually grasp it, that we need to wipe the slate clean and realize we need to start from scratch and start to absorb and put together the pieces of the puzzle that has been completely distorted by history and those that wrote our history books. I just did a full-day workshop. I mean, I'm standing here, I'm drinking coffee to stay awake because I've just come back from doing a full-day workshop, so I'm about to keel over. But it's exciting just to plug back into this thing that I've just spent the whole day taking people through, because it's so important to wrap your head around this. Okay?
Right.
Because if you think that we know a lot about our human history, you'd be completely mistaken. All you have to do is realize that every time there's a global conflict or some sort of a conflict, we lose a huge amount of knowledge and history. And we use this phrase, history is written by the victors, right? Everyone throws that out all the time. Well, history books are written by the victors.
Right.
Well, yes, they are. But what does it actually mean? Well, it means that our history books and our perception of history that have been written by the victors has a profound effect on how much we actually know about our human history. What it tells us is that we know absolutely nothing about those people that were conquered or those people that were destroyed. What do we know about the thousands and thousands of villages and towns and places and the millions of people that were destroyed by Alexander the Great and his armies? We know absolutely nothing about them.
Right.
But we know everything about Alexander the Great and how great he was. Well, he was no better than Hitler. He just invaded armies, enslaved the people, destroyed everything, and then he was declared the Great, Alexander the Great. Well, I'm not so sure about that. So just to give you an example how little we actually know about history, all you have to do is do a little mathematical study, and you realize that if we lose 50% of the information during a conflict situation, then it only takes about 8 conflict situations for us to know less than 1% of the original truth. And if you carry on, you very quickly realize that it is absolutely spectacular how little we actually know about the original truth.
Right. So I'm sure the listeners are wondering, what findings or what have you found there in Africa? Have you found anything like the giant skeletons of previous humans or anything like that?
Well, at the moment, we haven't found any human remains. That is the one big mystery. Personally, to me, it's not really surprising because I believe that those would be well buried below several meters of soil and sediment. Remember that the reason why this ancient civilization here in South Africa has vanished because it was destroyed by the flood, the biblical flood, which came around 13,000 years ago. That is a well-accepted historical event. It's well documented and accepted by geologists and climatologists and so forth that believe that there was this huge global event about 13,000 years ago. And we find that the ruins of southern Africa, this ancient, large stone settlement, is actually the largest settlement ever built by people on planet Earth in all of history. It's spectacular.
Wow.
I mean, it covers pretty much all of southern Africa. So imagine taking Texas and Arizona together and maybe one other state and saying, well, all of that was once covered by a giant ongoing settlement. Just try and imagine that.
That's pretty amazing.
It's spectacularly large. You just need to try and imagine that. And that has all been wiped out. It's gone. It's under the soil. You can still see large parts of it from the aerial and satellite photographs on certain times of the day when the light comes from a certain angle, and you can see the stuff actually lying below the soil. But when you walk on the mountains, you don't even know that you're walking on ancient ruins. There are, however, some of these ruins that have been rebuilt after the flood. The people came back and they started rebuilding their lives, and they carried on. According to the Sumerian tablets, we are told that after the flood, the gods came back to southern Africa, or as the Sumerian tablets call them, the Anunnaki, and they started rebuilding the gold mines, resettling the cities down here, and mining for gold with a newfound zest. They needed a lot more gold. And I believe it is at that time as well that they actually then moved into the Americas, and that's where the Mayas, the Incas, and all the Olmecs and all the gold mining civilizations and the ancient civilizations of the Americas were established about 13,000 years ago at that stage. That's why you see the Olmecs have very distinct African features. They wear these weird-looking hats that could be construed as mining helmets, if you want to look at them like that, made of leather or some sort of material like that. And it gets really interesting. And the Olmecs were clearly, based on our current knowledge of the Olmecs, were expert miners. Now, if you had an ancient mining civilization that ran here for 270,000 years in southern Africa, and you needed to very quickly start up a mining operation in the Americas, what would you do? You would take the guys from Africa and you'd bring them up there and say, please mine here,
Right.
So just to really answer your question is the ruins that we find here, and I have personally counted well over 10 million of these circular stone structures. I found three lost cities. One is near the town that I live, which is Watervalboef and Machadodorp area in the province called Mpumalanga, which means the place of the rising sun. And then there's one near Rustenburg and Sun City all the way to the Botswana border. That's another ancient lost city. And then there's the third one that I found is around the Great Zimbabwe ruins in Zimbabwe, and that whole area in the southeast and southern to central Zimbabwe. And there are more. There are many more. I stopped sort of when I got to those three. I thought, okay, well that's good enough for me. I'll stop there and let me just count how many of these stone circles there are in those three areas, and it comes to about 10 million and maybe more, which is spectacular.
Absolutely.
Remember, Joe, that the current history books tell us that southern Africa was a sparsely populated continent until about 1,000 years ago. There was not much going on here. There were a bunch of hunter-gatherers running around, shooting some buck and surviving in some weird way, and leaving behind some cave paintings and things for us to look at and be confused by. And that's the story that you read in history books.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, that's not the story that we get from the ancient stone ruins. They tell us a completely different story, that this part of the world was densely populated, and the stone ruins tell its own story.
Wow. Have you found anything like any startling discoveries, like a light bulb goes on, like an epiphany, like, oh my God?
Well, the main one is Adam's calendar.
Right.
I mean, that is really spectacular.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Adam's calendar is definitely the sort of flagship stone ruin among the ruins here in southern Africa. It is parked on the edge of a cliff overlooking what's known as the Barberton Impact Crater. It overlooks what is still today probably the richest gold mine in the world, Sheba Gold Mine. And the calendar is a fascinating. It is still accurately and working today, and that's the first thing I must stress. It is still working and accurate today. It tells you every day of the year that there are two large. Originally, it was a circular structure. It was a circular structure, perfectly aligned with north, south, east, and west. The marker stones are still in place, and we've measured it that it's absolutely perfectly aligned with north, south, east, west, except that it had slipped by about 3¼ degrees anti-clockwise, if you could imagine that. So the north, south, east, west alignment is slipped by 3¼ degrees in an anti-clockwise direction. Now that's a fascinating discovery, because that has got everything to do with not only with the precessional wobble of planet Earth at 26,000-year cycles, but also everything to do with the angle at which planet Earth lies, which we believe to be 23½ degrees right now. But this tells us that the angle of planet Earth has actually deviated by more than 3¼ degrees, or at least 3¼ degrees in the past. Okay, I personally believe that effect was as a result of the flood and the giant geophysical forces that would have caused such a giant flood of about 13,000 years ago. I believe that that's when it caused that shift. So Adam's calendar is lying perfectly perched on the edge of a cliff. The calendar site is the main feature of the whole cliff, but there are other features that run for about a 2-kilometer stretch along the edge of a cliff, where we've also found other amazing discoveries. Like we found a sphinx, a beautifully carved stone sphinx. It's about 2 meters long, stands about 1 meter high out of the ground. The calendar itself is aligned to the rise of Orion's belt, but you've got to go way beyond 200,000 years in the past for that alignment to match. And that's how we can say with a certain level of comfort that we believe that Adam's calendar is at least 200,000 years old. And there's also the Horus bird, the first so-called Egyptian Horus falcon head or Horus bird that's been carved, and that's actually the monolith that marks the rising of the sun on the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. And very quickly you realize that all the symbols that we thought were Egyptian or Sumerian symbols actually originate here from southern Africa. And that includes the Egyptian Ankh, the symbol of the Ankh, you know, the little cross with a little head at the top. The Egyptian Ankh is also actually a southern African symbol that eventually, many, many thousands of years later, was adopted by the Egyptians. And so it goes. So the discoveries are just so phenomenal and so far-reaching, and it impacts every civilization on Earth.
Do you think that you've just scratched the surface of all this also?
Yeah, that's definitely, Joe. It's the more I work on this, and the more Johann Heine and I look into this, the more we realize we are just scratching the surface. I have been working on this for 3 years now, full time, on this research. Johann has been doing it for over 7 years. And we're only starting to scratch the surface, and only now starting to understand the real depth of what was going on here. And that's the most exciting part, because we now know, you know, that there's a long way to go. So.
Absolutely. Are you finding anything, like you said about the calendar, and are you seeing anything that may depict any kind of futuristic event that may happen, such as the 2012 or, you know, Nibiru, or have you seen any paintings on walls or anything like that?
Everybody wants to know that. I wish we could. I tell you what we did also find, I forgot to mention, is the pyramids. The pyramids in the valley below Adam's calendar. They're also aligned with the rise of Orion. And there are also 3 pyramids, 2 larger pyramids and 1 smaller pyramid, but they're so well covered by the sediment and the soil that was deposited on them during the flood that we're probably only seeing half of the pyramids sticking out. And my guess is they're probably about 30 or 40 meters covered by soil and debris, you know, from the flood. And
what is your take on the pyramids and why were they created in your opinion?
Well, the Giza pyramids are definitely energy devices. There's no question about it. With the main pyramid, The Great Pyramid is definitely an energy device, and I believe the others were just spin-offs of the main one.
Mm-hmm.
What's fascinating is that there are 22 of those pyramids around the Giza Plateau, and the number 22 becomes very prominent in human history and in our current discoveries in science and ancient knowledge of physics and sacred geometry and all that.
Mm-hmm.
22 seems to be reoccurring all the time. And so I believe that these pyramids that we have here were actually the first pyramids that were ever built. They not only aligned with Adam's calendar and the rise of Orion, but they also aligned with the Great Zimbabwe ruins, the main site is Great Zimbabwe, and also the Great Pyramid of Giza. And they all built along the 31-degree east longitudinal line.
So like a landline?
Which is, yeah, it's a line that is very prominent. That 31 degrees east seems to be very, very prominent in human history and African culture and ancient African knowledge, and it's like an energy line and a ley line of great significance. And what I find fascinating as well, Joe, is that the number 31 in Hebrew and ancient culture, actually its numeric value is equivalent to the biblical Elohim. You know that the biblical Elohim is actually a plural. The biblical gods is a plural, and much later it was changed to a singular God in the Bible. But in the original Bible, it was always Elohim, which is the plural gods. And the numeric value in Hebrew for Elohim is 31. And we find Adam's calendar and its pyramids and Great Zimbabwe and the Great Pyramid of Giza and probably many other structures which we haven't found yet are built along that line. So I think they were trying to tell us something, you know?
Right. So what's amazing to me is how big these pyramids are and the lack of technology at that particular time. And like, how did they build these? And you got to take a look at that without any other kind of technology, like the way we would perceive it today with our current history. So you got to think that somebody was there to be able to step in and have some kind of other technology, even to what we have today.
Yeah. Well, we couldn't build the pyramid with technology we have today. I mean, I know that some architects and engineers will tell you, yeah, we can do it, but there are many out there that will tell you that we could do it, but it's going to be difficult. It's really, really going to be difficult. The technology they use, I'm now beginning to see very clearly, and that's really, again, it's from the discoveries that we're making here with these ancient ruins. And we're discovering that these guys had a very astute understanding of vibrational frequency and the use of sound as a tool and a source of energy. And this is very, very clear when you start researching this. And I'll make this very clear in my new book, Temples of the African Gods. I show people how they use this energy and their knowledge of the sound frequency to convert into an energy source. And once that penny drops, then suddenly you start to realize that these guys were way ahead of the pack. You know, we got no idea how advanced these guys were. And the very basic and simple tools they actually were able to use to do all these things. You know, we complicate technology so much. It's unbelievable. You know, while these guys just had a very keen and basic understanding of sound vibrational frequency, and with that, you can elevate rocks of any shape or size. You can drill absolute perfect holes down to a micron depth or width or any size you choose. You can crush and pulverize rock to the finest powder within seconds and minutes. You can do anything you want if you have the understanding of how to utilize vibrational sound frequency as an energy source.
Right.
And that's what these guys clearly understood. And that is totally and utterly imprinted in the ancient stone ruins of southern Africa. And that was the biggest discovery we actually made, is that they used the sound frequency that came out of, well, not came, but still comes out of the surface of planet Earth, and they converted that to energy and used it. And guess what? That's exactly what Nikola Tesla discovered in the late 1800s. And before him, John Keely, and that lived in Philadelphia. He made the same discoveries. These guys were the pioneers of sound in the last 120 years. They knew all this stuff. They rediscovered this information that was used by ancient civilizations. But they were never allowed to bring it to the market because their information was removed from the view of the greater global public because, the controlling royal political elite controlling groups that control this planet, they certainly don't want the global population to have free energy and gravity-free, vehicles and transportation systems. They want to charge us for it.
Right. This takes me back when I was a teenager. I saw something on television. It was either on Unsolved Mysteries or one of those shows, and a gentleman, and I'm not quite sure exactly where in the world it was. For some reason, it puts me in the mind it was around California or somewhere like that. But at any rate, the gentleman found a way of how they manipulated energy, and he actually had all kind of things at his residence that would defy how we understand like physics, and this was a long time ago. This was actually, probably 20 years ago anyway. And he had a stone there that it was like, say it was like a square in its shape, but it was so many ton that they don't know how he got it in a position where it would just spin and rotate on its axis, and they don't know to this day how he actually moved some of these stones, and actually how and what you're telling me here. I mean, it sounds like this guy has since passed away and took those secrets, or so he thought, with his to his grave. But that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Once you embrace the concept of using vibrational frequency and using the sound frequency as an energy source, everything becomes a lot easier to deal with. Really, it's as simple as that. And it is, at this stage, it really is the only plausible scientific explanation for what happened here and why these ancient civilizations could move such giant stones, how they could cut them with such precision,
right?
And fit them together so precisely. You can't do that with the kind of metal, steel, Newtonian lifting pulleys. You can't do it with that technology. It's just not possible.
Right.
It really is not.
As you're talking here, it just another thing clicked into my mind is those the skulls, those crystal skulls. And I don't know if Hewlett Packard took a look at them and was like, hey, there's no markings from what our traditional carving tools are, whether it be, I don't know, titanium or whatever. I'm not well versed with that, but they're not quite sure how they were produced way back then. Like, we couldn't even reproduce that today.
Exactly. Now, the crystal skulls are another wonderful example of ancient technology, ancient civilizations doing things just to, I don't know, maybe to show future civilizations that there was an advanced knowledge and a civilization on planet Earth a long time ago. Just think, what are we going to leave behind? If we were about to be wiped out by a giant flood or a giant meteor or a giant solar flare or, I don't know, something, it's going to wipe all of us out and just leave behind a few people, let's say in the jungles, whatever. Eventually, after a few hundred years or 1,000 years, they come out of the jungles and start discovering new things and etc. and realize that there was this other civilization who lived before them, and what are we going to leave behind? Well, what are the people going to find? Computer bits?
Yeah, not a whole heck of a lot.
Exactly, not a heck of a lot, because all our writing is on computers. It's either in books made out of paper that'll probably disappear and disintegrate in no time.
Right.
Our computer chips and our computers are worth absolutely nothing. One solar flare and everything's going to be fried.
Right.
And so what are we going to? How are the civilizations that survive going to pick up the pieces and figure out what went on?
Right.
It's quite an interesting thing to wrap your head around.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not that, that suddenly you realize why these ancient civilizations wrote things on clay tablets, why they carved things into hard rock that couldn't erode very easily, it couldn't be easily destroyed, because they realized that if something happened to them, they want to leave behind advanced knowledge imprinted in symbols and symbolisms and whatever for future civilizations that survived to be able to say, look, there were advanced civilizations on this planet in the past. But we're so bloody arrogant and so conceited, and our ego is riding such shotgun over our lives, that we can't accept for 1 second that there could have been more advanced civilizations in the past. Well, the sooner we get over that little ego trip, the better for us all.
Right. So do you actually perceive, or with maybe not even with your studies, but do you have a personal knowing that maybe we're around that time of that 26,000 years where the climate's changing, and whether Nibiru's coming back around, or whether there's a cataclysmic event or anything like? Because there's a lot of things leading up to 2012 and the Mayan calendar and all this other stuff. I mean, what's your take on all that?
Well, clearly we first got to look at the Mayan calendar. Mayas are not the only people that knew that there was this 26,000-year cycle. The Vedas knew it as well. I know the Hopi people of North America, they have a culture that goes back. They talk about the change in the cycles of the good cycles, the golden ages and the silver ages and so forth. They also talk about the blue star, and many ancient civilizations talk about the blue star and the coming of destruction and the rising of a new age and so forth. So this is something that's been going around for a long time, and this knowledge has been held by ancient civilizations for a long time. And clearly they had a reason to do that, because we are now starting to discover with pure science and physics, understanding the cycles that happen in our solar system, the cycles that happen in our galaxy, in the Milky Way, and then also in the other galaxies, how things work. The fact that there are these galactic pulses that happen every so often and basically pretty much are responsible for a lot of destruction throughout that galaxy, and then the restarting of life after that. And so you've got to look at the Mayas and say, well, how credible are these guys? And as far as we know, they are incredibly credible, because so far we cannot really fault their knowledge of the cosmos, their timekeeping ability, and so forth. That is deadly accurate. So if they say that some event is going to happen, and we calculate that event to be on the 21st of December 2012, which happens to be the solstice, the summer solstice in the southern hemisphere and the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. If they tell us that something significant is going to happen, then we better sit back and pay attention, because these guys knew a lot of stuff a long time before we reinvented it or rediscovered it.
Right.
And it's not just the Mayas, as I said, it's the Vedas, the Vedas, the Vedic civilization as well, and so forth. And but it also ties in with our current knowledge and understanding of the flow of energy from the galactic center, the galactic bulge.
Right.
The work of people like Paul Laviolette and various others that show that there's this huge outburst of energy periodically from the galactic center, and it now seems to be that this is not just a destructive force, but it's also a creative force. Is that this light and this energy source that comes from the galactic center is actually the primordial creative source for the galaxy, and it is an unstoppable force of creation. And that's quite interesting. It's really, really interesting. So I believe that, first of all, our solar system as it is, it's not just a planet spinning around the sun, right? But it's also the entire solar system that spins in a spiral through space. It doesn't just, fly in one line.
Right.
It actually spirals.
Everything in constant motion.
Yeah. Everything in motion, exactly. Everything in the universe spins, which includes our galaxies and our solar systems. Mm-hmm. And while the solar system spins, it crosses the galactic plane, the center of the Milky Way. It crosses that every 13,000 years in a 26,000-year orbit. And that's also an interesting thing that the Mayas and the Vedas seem to have known. And every time you cross that galactic orbit, you are filled with this new source of energy and consciousness and flow of knowledge that people are just filled with. And it seems that this is what we're about to experience. We're about to experience this outburst of the growth of consciousness that is just spreading throughout the world like a wildfire. And I'm sure you and your listeners are very well aware of that. Mm-hmm. And that's just not accidental. That's because we're coming very, very close to being aligned with exactly the center of the galactic plane.
Right.
That's when it hits us the hardest. And this unstoppable force of knowledge and consciousness and evolution really takes a hold of us as a species and does some profound things to us, because it's also now evident that our DNA is not just this blueprint for our human physique, but it's also actually a receptor and a transmitter of knowledge and information of this light, this galactic central light that feeds this evolution of our DNA. It switches on certain genes that allows us to have ability of higher consciousness, maybe switch on the pineal gland that gives us more powers of ESP and all these kind of things. And it's just a beautiful story. So yeah, 2012 is not just an event. I think it's a crossing and a reaching of a very important point in the growth and explosion in our current rate of consciousness and our ability to plug into the knowledge of the universe.
Right. I really think that a lot of this has to do with whether we are spiritual beings living a human existence, and we've lived maybe thousands or millions of lives. And I think that DNA, as you said, if you think of everything as energy, and it carries a vibrational signature or energy. I mean, different people have dis-ease whenever their vibrational energies or their inner being is off, per se. And I think that if you look at DNA as a vibration or a light, if you will, and it carries that signature, I think that with this planetary alignment and the energies that are coming through, it's actually going to change that DNA to a point that we as human beings will most likely evolve into even a different species, per se. Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, I think you're spot on there. What we're going to evolve into, I really don't know, and I'm not going to hazard a guess at this
right.
stage. But we're certainly growing incredibly quickly. And I mean, I've just done this workshop today. At the north coast on the east coast of South Africa, just north of a city called Durban, and it's just I'm on a private golf estate. There's a lot of wealthy people around and so forth, and I thought it was important to come and spread this information here. And I'm just absolutely amazed every time I do one of these talks and these workshops. I'm amazed at how completely connected large numbers of people have become and are becoming.
Right.
It's absolutely amazing.
I agree with you. And you know what? The people are ready to hear this now, whereas maybe at one time in history they were not. And I think it comes down to the person's perspective, whether they're willing to go within and face themselves, and whether they had cellular memories that are attached to the DNA and face them and move on will help them ascend into this higher consciousness. Whereas if you look at it in fear, I mean, then we get into dimensions, and it's almost like you're stuck in 3D, this dense life that we live here. But I think we're much more than just 3D physical beings. I think we're spiritual beings that are actually multidimensional, and that we can actually tap into universal knowledge if we raise our vibrational energy. And so if you look at things as energy, it's a little bit easier to comprehend and wrap your head around. But, you got to start somewhere. And it's funny to try to be discernful, to talk to different individuals at different levels, because, some people you can talk right on to and they got it. They're right with you. And then other people, you have to just give them a little, kind of plant the seed and let that grow and let them, digest it a little bit. And then they come back and say, okay, well, I got that now. Have you found anything like that, or have you found that there are more people now than ever are open to the possibilities?
Definitely, it's it's growing unprecedentedly, and it's an exponential growth according to my observations. And just to come back to what you said about this, this growth in the light and our DNA absorbing and being this light and all that, that's exactly what this evolution of the human species is all about, as far as my understanding is right now.
Right.
And it's these damn Russians that, once again, a couple of years ago, they just seem to be, in my opinion, always one step ahead of the pack. But, you hardly ever hear about these discoveries. But then I suppose the Americans may be doing it, but it's been done behind closed doors as well, so we'll probably never hear about it when they're doing it in the secret laboratories. It's not for our eyes. It's just for a small, unique, group
right.
to know that, they'll share that information with those who they deem are fit.
Well, you know what's funny? With this whole thing, with what you're talking about and all that, it's almost like something drastic or major has to happen to reset this whole culture, if you will, or the way the world works right now. And, people in power don't want to give up power, and that's even at the latest level of understanding. So sometimes something major has to come in to push out the old and allow the new to come in. And I think that's what this 2012 is really about. And I think there is going to be enlightenment and a lot of great blessings that will come through. But if you look at it in the eyes of fear, it can be scary because you're looking at the earth as she's kind of shaking off all the negativity, per se, in certain areas, whether it be hurricanes or earthquakes. And but if you welcome the change and you look at it from an observer's point of view, it's more acceptable, and it makes it okay, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. The evolution is unstoppable. It's
right.
It's not clear to me that the reason why people are waking up at such a rapid rate is because they can't control it. It's not up to you to control. Your DNA picks up that light from the galactic center,
right?
And it's unstoppable. You can't control it.
Ready or not, here it comes.
Ready or not, you're gonna be enlightened. You're gonna be given the opportunity. Your DNA is evolving. Genes are being switched on that previously were dormant. You're going to suddenly, unexpectedly find yourself with abilities and that you can't understand.
Right.
You maybe start seeing things, seeing different dimensions that you couldn't see before, hearing voices that you couldn't hear before. You can read people's minds that suddenly and it's going to start freaking you out.
Right.
If you're not ready for that information, it could be a very scary situation.
Absolutely.
So it's important for people to know this. So if it happens to them, that they actually realize that this is happening. I'm just evolving. My DNA is evolving. It's giving me much more higher abilities and knowledge that I've been denied of and deprived of. And now I'm finally getting the ability and the chance to put to test and to use these abilities I should have had in the first place.
Right.
And embrace this change and embrace this evolution. But if the people aren't aware of this, it could freak them out and push them over the edge. I mean, it could be really scary.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what's something else that I've noticed is the people that were kind of ahead of their time, and they've been out there preaching this for years and years and years, and they were considered crazy or, it's actually a time for them to come out and say, now, take a look at this, because within the next few years, you'll be coming to me for the answers because you didn't take a look when I told you before.
Yeah, exactly. But that's always the case, isn't it? I mean, look at the people of the past, Galileo.
Right.
I mean, even if you look at the prophets, the great messiahs and prophets, from Krishna to Akhenaten is one as well, in my opinion, and the Buddha and Christ.
Right.
All these guys came and started sharing the truth about the universe and the spiritual entity, the fact that we're spiritual beings and that God was God and the divine being is within us, that we all one.
Right.
That unity is the ultimate reality, and only love is a true eternal emotional aspect of reality and whatever, and people, those messages have been, I mean, the religions have tried their best to actually cover up the true Christ conscious message.
Absolutely.
If you start reading your Bible again and all the other ancient scripts, that's what comes out very loud and very clear. That those guys were actually trying to tell us these things
But the authorities at the time didn't like it. They absolutely weren't happy with that at all. It's like, John Keeley and Royal Raymond Rife finding the cure for all disease, and Nikola Tesla giving us free electricity and free energy. The authorities aren't going to like that. They're not going to allow that. They want absolute control. And they've been doing it for thousands of years. They're not going to give up now. And as you said, it's going to take, in my opinion, I agree with you completely, it's going to take an external event, something that is not controlled, something that humanity cannot control, to change the guard, to kick out the current controlling royal political elite structures that are holding the planet in a grip of enslavement, and it's getting worse and worse, and to actually take away their power and allow a new global structure to take over. That's really what I'm working on as well. I call it contributionism, and I'll be writing quite a lot more about that. It's a beautiful, beautiful alternative and a real light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely.
For the gloomy, dark, desperate state that the world is in at the moment.
Right. So, speaking of your writing, do you want to go over your website again in a couple of your books? And then what I'd like to do is go over or take some callers, but go ahead with your website.
Sure. You can go to slavespecies.com, and also zuluplanet.com. There you can get our books there. All my books are available there. Also, our website for the foundation, which is makomati.org. That's M-A-K-O-M-A-T-I, Makomati. Incidentally, that word comes from a Hindu Dravidian term for gold miners and gold merchants, which were gold miners and gold merchants that were here in South Africa and Southern Africa 2,000 years ago, maybe as far back as about 4,000 years, and they were known as the Komati people, and they were of Indian Dravidian origins, and they came here to mine gold. And I find it interesting because there could be a lot of confusion thinking that a lot of the Hindu and Dravidian symbols were brought here by those people at that particular point in time. While actually, if you look at the origins of those symbols, just like in Egypt, the winged disc, the Horus, the Sphinx, the Ankh, all those symbols originated here. And we've got them in my new book, Temples of the African Gods. You can see all those original symbols that were hundreds of thousands of years old, which then migrated to the rest of the world. So it's interesting that when the Hindu Dravidian miners came to Southern Africa to mine gold, they must have been very surprised to walk into symbols that they would have been very familiar with in their own culture and tradition.
Right. Okay, so here it's 11 o'clock. We have about an hour left. I'd like to take some callers now. The phone number here is area code 814-342-1260. If you have any questions for Michael, or if you have any thoughts you would like addressed, give us a call. And while we're waiting, we have somebody here actually that would like to ask you a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right. My name's Dan. One of the main questions that really always pops up in my debates with my friends is you were talking about the light that comes out of the center of the universe, and every 13,000 years, 26,000 year cycle. What exactly is that light? Because that's at the point whenever my one friend is a doctor, and he always tries to put things into a scientific perspective, and he said, well, evolution just can't happen instantly like that. There has to be, it's a mutation from over years and years and years of things going on. I said to him, look, it just happens. That's one of his things. Like, what exactly is this light that you talk about, so I can at least give a good rebuttal for him?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I'll tell you where the answer to that is phenomenal. And what your friend suggests is that evolution takes over thousands of years and mutations and this, and they cause that and so forth. Well, that's the old belief and the new evidence actually conflicts completely with that. And there's a guy by the name of Dan Burish, Dr. Dan Burish, who's been doing some very interesting work and research on all kinds of things. He's got a project. If you want to go check it up on the internet, you'll find a lot of information about Dan Burish, and he's got working on a project called the Lotus Project. I think it's called the Lotus Project.
Yeah.
And in this particular project, they've been doing some research with stones, silica-based stones, which I find fascinating because the circular stone structures that are built here in southern Africa of this first civilization, all of those stones are of a very specific structure. It's only one stone that was used right across this entire region. They didn't just use any stone. It was only one specific stone that they used, and that particular stone is known as the hornfels. And it's about 54% silica dioxide, about 23% aluminium, and about 13% iron. And it's that specific combination that seemed to have been very important to them. And they never swayed away from that. Now, the interesting thing about that is that those stones ring like bells. They absolutely ring like beautiful bells. And it's for that reason that I started being interested in the sound harmonic frequency and realized that these are actually energy-generating devices and so forth. But I'm digressing a bit. Just to come back to Dan Burish, he found that this particular quartz stone that contains quartz gives off what they call pockets of electromagnetic energy. Now, I'm just throwing that in because it adds value to the argument that we're dealing with ancient knowledge of generating energy and so forth. But not only that, what they found is that when they created a sterile environment, and absolutely sterile environment enclosed in a hermetically sealed capsule, and when they exposed it to this particular light, and especially in the presence of crystals and or this quartz stone, within a matter of days, if I understand it correctly, within a matter of days, they had spontaneous creation and generation of life. Just out of the blue, where nothing should exist and nothing could possibly exist.
What do you mean? What, like
animal cells just suddenly spontaneously appeared.
That's amazing. I've never heard this.
Oh yeah, I've heard that. In fact, David Wilcox also speaks of that. He's done some research in this as well. And I have researched Dan Burish also, and he says the same thing. So that is, I'm just sitting here shaking my head, going, yep, heard that. And I think in fact what they've done, I think David Wilcox says something in the lines of the researchers, and I don't know if it was Russian researchers, but they actually put a certain particular light, whether it be laser, I don't know what it was, into an embryo, but because they passed it through different DNA, they changed, say, a lizard to a frog or something like that, but just by the changing of the light.
That's it. They were, if I remember correctly, you're quite right, Joe. It was a Russian researcher that did that, and they took a lizard and an embryo and a frog embryo, and they passed a non-lethal laser beam through the lizard embryo into the frog embryo, and the frog turned out to be born as a lizard. Just shows you that light carries information.
Absolutely.
And it has the potential to change DNA, and that's exactly what's happening to us with this galactic central light that reaches us and actually changes and mutates our DNA. A beautiful example of that.
Absolutely. One other thing that they did was they with a chicken and a duck, and whenever they passed the information or the light through, the chicken actually came out. It almost looked half chicken, half duck, because it had a longer neck, it had webbed feet. I mean, it was just amazing just by passing this light through the embryo. And so right there shows you something. I mean, you have to scratch your head and take a look at it or raise an eyebrow or something to do further research in my mind.
Are there pictures of this?
Yeah, it's all over the internet. If you get on the David Wilcox, I think it's divinecosmos.com.
Yeah, David has been doing some amazing work. I think Dan Burich is doing some really exciting stuff.
Absolutely.
And people need to have a closer look at that. But what I find exciting is that everything I read up and study what they are doing, I can link directly back to this ancient civilization.
Yep.
These guys that lived here 300,000 years ago that already had that knowledge and were applying that knowledge to the mining of gold.
Right.
Okay, now, the other important thing that I must tell you is that many of these stone circular structures are of a very strange and a peculiar shape. Okay, some of those structures are like a beehive. It's like a hexagonal shapes that are maybe about 3 meters in diameter across, and they clustered together like a honeycomb. It's absolutely amazing, and it makes no sense whatsoever why anybody would build such structures.
I think some of that has to do with the geometric, ancient or sacred geometric shapes, symbols, and I think there's a universal law that's out there, just kind of like mathematics, that 1 + 1 = 2. And I mean, so.
Yeah.
I think that with the
I'll tell you about that universal law. I'm working on another book which we call Secret Numbers of God, with a brilliant scientist called Willem de Swart, and Willem has managed to decode the whole matrix of the universe. Everything, every sacred symbol, every ancient symbol, any number that you've ever imagined. Willem has managed to decode and actually understand and put in a very, very simple to understand presentation.
That's
it
amazing.
Is quite mind-blowing to see how simple this entire structure is, and we've just complicated so much
know.
with our
That's what I'm thinking.
With our mathematics,
Right. Yep.
And just to add to what you were saying, the hexagon and the pentagon are two very important. They actually the cube as well. But let me start with the hexagon and the pentagon. Before I get there, sorry, because I jumped the gun a little bit. I was talking about those hexagonal ruins, right? Those stone structures that are in the hexagonal shape. We understand that the hexagonal shape is a very strong shape for the flow of energy. Okay, that has been known by ancient civilizations and so forth. So that's clearly, depicted in forever and ever as far as you go back. But what suddenly we find is that I believe that those beehive, honeycomb, hexagonal structures were actually the cloning tanks where the Anunnaki were cloning these early humans. And they cloned them into adult beings because you don't want to clone people into babies.
Right.
You don't want to have born in and have to bring them up, wipe their noses and their bums for 16 years, and then one day you say, okay, now you must go work in the gold mines.
Right.
So that's not what would have happened here. When they started mining the gold here, they would have been cloning those early humans in those strange places and cloning them into adulthood so that they could come out of there absolutely, ready to go to work. And that is an amazing thought to just try and comprehend.
Were they cloning women, or was it only men?
No, at that stage it seems like they were only cloning women. Only cloning men. Only cloning men. In the Bible, Adam is put into a deep sleep, or in the Sumerian tablets even more, in much more greater details. But when they put Adam or Adamu into a deep sleep and they take his rib, and they clone the female species out of his rib. Now, it makes perfect sense if you are trying to clone a female partner for an existing species. You're not going to take the DNA and mess with the DNA and start from scratch. You're going to take the essence of that being. So maybe it's bone marrow, and I suppose that's why they took the rib. It's the closest bone to the outside surface, right? Take a rib and take out some of the bone marrow, get the blood out, and then re-manipulate the DNA and add the sex chromosome to it. And that's how we have 23 pairs of chromosomes instead of 22 pairs of chromosomes, because the 23rd pair is the sex, the X and the Y chromosomes. And they sort of slapped on at the end. What I find interesting is that the Sumerian tablets tell us in great detail about this process. How Adamu was put into a deep sleep and the essence was taken out of his rib, and then Eve was cloned, and she was a partner so they could procreate together. And then you have the situation where in the Bible it's reduced to sort of one, maybe two lines, where Eve was fashioned out of his rib, and that's simple. That's what it is. But I believe that they were cloning these humans for several thousand years, and only males were cloned until they realized that they weren't keeping up with the cloning process, and they wanted to actually let them procreate on their own so they could get more of these buggers to work in the mines. And that's when they cloned the female species and said, come, you just procreate and we don't have to worry about bloody cloning tanks,
No, I had been thinking about this over the last week or so, about how exactly would have the human species have gone away from all the slave tactics, we'll say. And one of the things that I actually thought was that they found us as a species, they wanted to clone us, but then ended up having too much compassion for us. See, there's the kicker, the too much compassion, and then they just sort of let us go on our own and found this woman and did this all for us.
I suppose there's some element of, in my opinion, I would agree with aspects of that. I think the compassion came when we started procreating and the children were born. I think once the children of the new species started running around, and people like Enki started seeing these children running around, I think it certainly brought out the compassion for this new species, and he started to really understand and like them. And also, just like we are today, growing in consciousness and growing in understanding and growing in knowledge, that species over thousands of years started to develop and started to grow in knowledge and started to absorb levels of consciousness.
Right.
And once you start absorbing levels of consciousness, it's very difficult to start treating those beings just as robots.
Right.
And suddenly that's when the compassion really started to kick in from the Anunnaki and the original slave masters.
Right. Not to mention that they were probably procreating with the females themselves, which they probably weren't supposed to do initially. That's a guess.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. I was going to add something where I lost my train of thought.
Well, sorry about that. I was thinking that maybe some of the people that are more enlightened or more psychic or actually have some of the DNA of these gods, per se. More so, like they have a higher percentage of the particular DNA from the gods, if you will. And considering that we are thousands and thousands of years old, as far as like an evolution on this planet, like you're saying, the Anunnaki is only one race that we just talked about today. Now, what about all the other races of, if there's one, then you got to wonder, there's got to be more. And if they have actually came at different times and procreated, and maybe different people have different gifts, maybe that has something to do with why some people are good at one thing and other people's are good at another.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I mean, that's one of the biggest mysteries on planet Earth, the different race groups on planets, on this planet. How the hell did all these different race groups appear?
Right.
Yes, you can clearly see some of the race groups are crossing over of two different race groups and so forth. That you can see. Some of them are reasonably clearly seen. In South Africa, we've got some examples like that, but where do the Chinese people come from? I mean, Chinese and Asian people are so distinctly, completely different from, the Caucasians, the blue-eyed blondes from Scandinavia. We're so completely and utterly different from the very dark and black people from Central Africa. We're completely different from the red-skinned Bushmen, the petite little red-skinned Bushmen with slanty Chinese-looking eyes. We're completely different from the Aboriginals.
Right.
Who are completely different from the American, Native American people. And you start looking at this and you go, what the hell is going on here?
Right.
If we were all created out of one race, how the hell did this happen? it's not really possible for it to happen. Okay, it's not possible to happen unless you have a different genetic donor at some point in time.
Right. You know, a lot of things with evolution also can be explained, like there's always this missing link, like how did we get from this to that? And if you would imagine that the energy that comes through every 26,000 years, just like we're talking about the chicken or the lizard or the frog, and if that energy comes through, changes our DNA in a way that changes us as a species, there's your missing link. It doesn't have to be total evolution where years and years and years and years and years, and that's what develops. It could be you have developed to a certain point, but then all of a sudden, bam, you get hit by this energy frequency, if you will, or this light that can actually penetrate the DNA and change your neural net. And, I mean, what if? I'm just saying what if.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite plausible. Absolutely plausible. I wouldn't discount that for a second. But my obsession right now is to try and get to understand more about this vanished ancient civilization and how it was in southern Africa, what we call them the first people now. Mm-hmm. That's also based on the words of Credo Mutwa, and I've spent a lot of time with Credo. I don't know if you're familiar with Credo Mutwa.
No.
He is like the wise man of South Africa. He is a Sanusi shaman, the highest level shaman you can get. He is also a Sangoma, which is a South African equivalent of a shaman, and the highest level Sangoma. And he broke the ranks and became highly disliked when he wrote his incredible book called Indaba, My Children. I think that was first released in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. And when he wrote that book, he basically tells the full story and the history of the world and the African people and all the tradition. And like I mentioned earlier, the Abelungu, the white sky gods that came down and created the African people to do what? To mine gold and all these things. And he spills the beans on all this ancient African knowledge and tradition. And Credo has been talking about the coming of the strange ones, of the lizard people, the reptilians, and all this other stuff. And the connection of the ancient African tribes and the ancient African people in southern Africa, or what we call the first people, and talking about the fact that this is where all civilization started. And when he started saying this in the 60s, and very early in his life, people were laughing at him. They thought he was crazy.
Right.
Really. And now I'm really so happy that we are making the discoveries that vindicate people like Credo Mutwa and others like him that have been, at the brunt of being made a laughstock by so-called intelligent Western scholars and so forth. When the so-called intelligent Western scholars have no idea what the hell they're dealing with.
Right. So, I want to switch gears here a little bit and give you an opportunity to talk about music and how it relates to your archaeological work and how frequency and music, I think you do something like that, don't you? Can you relate music and how the pitch or the tone or the vibrational energy has something to do with any of this?
Well, it's really my understanding of music that really made me sit up and pay attention and make the discovery that I believe now is what went on here, is the fact that they used sound vibrational frequency. And you know that it's important to understand why music and sound frequency is so important in human history. Remember that in biblical terms we say, we hear that in the beginning there was the Word of God. And what is Word? The Word is a sound frequency. Okay, it's a pitch, it's a sound frequency, it's a vibrational frequency.
Right.
In Buddhism, we're told that the primordial creative source is the Om. The Om, and guess what? The Om has six aspects.
Right.
Just like the 6 days of creation, on the 7th day you rest. In Om you got the 6 aspects of Om, and then you got the Om symbol itself in the center. And so suddenly you realize that Christianity and Buddhism have exactly the same origins from a perspective of sound and sound vibrational frequency. And when we were clearing some of these stone ruins, I heard the sound of the stones. And I realized that the stones ring like bells.
Right.
And that's because they're made of this very specific combination of rock, very, very hard, extremely hard rock, metamorphosized quartzite, and it's the crystal, it's the silica dioxide, the crystal quartz in it, the component that gives it those very special properties, which I believe were the reason why these ancients used just that particular stone.
Okay.
Because it rings like a bell, and I believe that they used that vibrational frequency and the energy of that rock to create a standing wave and create a sound frequency, which they could then convert and use into any other form of energy that they could use. Also, remember that these stone ruins, all of them are originally linked by what we call these ancient roads. Thousands of miles of roads or channels that originally linked each and every one of these stone circles right across southern Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're actually looking at is one giant energy creating plant. The entire African subcontinent was one giant energy grid that had the capacity to generate energy and feed itself with this energy. And they use that energy for everything you can imagine, for heat, for crushing the ore, from separating the gold from the crushed powder, from separating the platinum and the iron, and they use that frequency for everything.
Right. So I got to ask you, I'm curious now. I mean, with you being in the presence of these, what we would call landlines, do you feel anything? Like, I know you can hear the pitch and all that, but do you get a different feeling of any kind of euphoria or anything from stepping in one location to another, per se?
Joseph, I don't. Unfortunately, I'm not psychic at all, and I don't feel these things. I seem to be an intuitive.
I see.
That's my strength.
Okay,
that's my strength. And
are there psychics in the area that do that, though? Like, is there any experiences that other people that have different abilities, per se?
Definitely.
Oh, okay.
I've had many psychics, many people that feel are very sensitive to energy. I've taken them out to the stone ruins. I've taken them out to Adam's calendar many times, and I've learned a great deal from psychic people and people that have the ability to feel energy and find the flow of energy and so forth. And what I can tell you is that Adam's calendar is on a very, very strong, probably, well, according to these psychics, the strongest energy line in the whole southern African region. There's a specific reason for that, because it's now clear to us that based on what Credo Mutwa told us is that he was initiated at the site in 1937 at Adam's calendar. And he calls it one of the two most sacred sites on planet Earth. And he said to me more than a year ago now, year and a half ago, when I first met him and spoke to him. And incidentally, I have a 4-hour-long DVD that's available on ZuluPlanet.com that I put together of my discussions with Credo Mutwa. So for people that are interested in hearing what Credo has to say and all his wisdom and knowledge,
right,
they can get. He told me at that stage that Adam's calendar is where heaven mated with Mother Earth. And I didn't understand it. I couldn't understand what that meant. And it took me another year to finally figure it out. And it was actually when I was there with a bunch of psychics. And we were at Adam's calendar itself, at the main calendar site. And there's one little area just inside the circle, inside the northern stone marker. And there's like a precinct of 3 fallen monoliths. The one is a sphinx, is a broken sphinx with a head that fell off. And the other 2 stones are strange shapes of some sort of shaped monolith that we can't figure out what they are. But right in the middle between those 3 monoliths, these psychic ladies went in one by one and they stood there, and the first one that stood there just started freaking out. She started saying, "Wow, this place makes me feel very uneasy. I feel like I'm I'm pregnant or something like that, or I'm nauseous, and etc. And she started freaking out, and she got out, and the next lady went in, and she said, yeah, I feel like I'm about to give birth, and I feel like I've got morning sickness, and etc. And the next one went in, and they each and every one repeated very similar kind of emotions and sensations that they were experiencing. And then I realized that it is right there in that spot that the Anunnaki impregnated the first 7 Anunnaki females with this fertilized egg to carry as surrogate mothers when they first cloned this new species called Homo sapien.
Huh.
And that is why Adam's calendar is such an important and sacred site in all of human history. So when Credo Mutwa told me this is where heaven mated with Mother Earth, suddenly the penny dropped for me, and I went, my goodness, that's what it's all about. That's where it happened.
Wow. That's really, really amazing.
And I saw Credo probably about 6 weeks ago again, and I asked him that question. I asked him, Credo, when you told me that this is where heaven mated with Mother Earth, did you mean that this is where the Anunnaki females, the 7 Anunnaki females, according to the Sumerian tablets, were impregnated? And he said, yes, that's what I meant.
Wow. So you got confirmation. That's awesome.
Yeah. And, Credo talks about the coming of the lizard people from Draco, the constellation Draco, and how they've taken over the planet. And I think many people are confused about the Anunnaki and the lizard people, the reptilians, and they're not the same. They're not the same people. I also have confirmation. Credo agrees with me on that. In some interesting channeling sessions that I just recently had, and these were my first experiences for this, so I'm quite new to it, but I managed to channel Enki himself and asked him a whole bunch of questions, and I got some very interesting answers, confirming most of the stuff that we were researching, confirming the ancient civilization, the gold mining, the reasons for it, the Great Zimbabwe, that the fact that there was actually his place, the mine manager's house on the hill, in Great Zimbabwe ruins. The fact that Adam's calendar was built 285,000 years ago, that it was there, that the first females were impregnated, that they did the surrogate cloning or fertilization, should I call the fertilization of the female species with the human beings, and so forth. So I got a lot of interesting confirmation on a lot of the stuff that I've been speculating on and getting snippets of information from either Sumerian tablets or circumstantial evidence that we find here, and timelines from linking it to star systems. But the most important thing that I've got is that the Anunnaki and the reptilians are not the same group of people.
Right.
It seems that the reptilians are the ones that arrived later, and they took control of this planet and were actually at war with the Anunnaki for quite some time. And when we read about the wars of the gods, I now believe that it was the reptilians and the Anunnaki that were actually fighting each other for a long time. And the humans were obviously observing this thing going on, and they didn't know what the hell was going on. It was the battle of the gods in the sky. They couldn't understand what was going on.
Right. I've had Terry Ippoletti, who's a good friend of mine. She's a deep channel, and she actually channeled for us here a couple weeks ago, which is on my website. And if you or the listeners want to check the website at universaltalk.info, I'll tell you what, it is amazing whenever you have a psychic that can actually put her ego aside and allow, like, an entity, if you will. It's almost like on the movie Ghost. I mean, she sets herself aside and allows that being to come into her physicalness or her body, and she just channels. And you can ask any question under the sun, and there it is. We've been doing it for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years now, almost every day, if not twice a day. And you get a lot of answers to a lot of questions that you never even, some of the perspectives I never even would have thought of. And I interview people like yourself, every week. So it's amazing what channeling can do.
Yeah, Yeah. I think a lot of people are scared of channeling, and I think it's important to be wary of it, because it's obviously an opportunity for malicious entities to mislead you and mislead us.
Absolutely.
So we've got to be aware of that all the time. But I think in your heart you feel, you resonate, whether it's authentic, whether it's true or not.
Right.
I think we've evolved enough to that level that we can feel those things. I can certainly feel those vibrations. And who did you say you channeled?
We didn't channel anybody in particular. It was more of like a race that came through, and as they come across or come through, they speak as though they're one. It's like a collective or a council, and it has various races within it. So any question that you ask, they have a better understanding or a better way of answering it, because there's so many I guess individuals from various specialties, if you will. I mean, that's the only way I can look at it. And anyway, her name's Terry Ippoletti. She's a psychic, a local psychic, which she's going to be here in Pennsylvania for another couple months, and then she's heading out west because, well, quite frankly, the energies out there are so much higher than they are here. This is a more dense location, and for psychics, it's almost like it brings them down and it decreases their psychic abilities, just like the landlines and all that. I mean, you have to consider that different parts of the world are at a higher vibrational energy or frequency, and therefore, you know, when you step into different places, if you're sensitive enough, and if that's a gift that you carry, you can actually feel it. So by her always calling upon the highest intent and the highest vibrational love of life, or unconditional love, I mean, she always brings in the highest source. So, I mean, I've never been worried about any negativity coming, and I would be able to tell. I mean, over the past 2 years, like you said, you can feel it, you can discern it. So, but it's amazing. Yeah. It really is. I mean, there's some people out there that have some major special gifts that you would be just blown away by, and she's one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I love finding people like that, because it's time that we start, you know, putting our egos aside, as I said earlier, and starting to embrace the knowledge and the abilities of people as these abilities come through from this unstoppable evolutionary process that we're experiencing as the human race right now. And I'm just really happy that I can be and very fortunate, I suppose, and find myself blessed that I'm able to bring the information of the ancient ruins and this first civilization that we believe is the first civilization, and share it with the rest of the world. It's a great story. It's a fantastic story, and in my opinion, right now, it's the most exciting story from the world of archaeology and history and discovery that we have.
Absolutely. And you know, you provide a specific piece to the puzzle, and that's how I look at this show. Is each week I have somebody different, from a different country, from a different walk of life, nationality, profession, and so many people that come on this show, almost everyone actually, that has any type of an enlightened mind. If you would go back through and just start from the beginning and listen to every single person that has been on my show, even though they're from different walks of life and they come with a different piece to the puzzle, there is a common knowledge about ETs and where our origin is from, and where we're going as a species, and so many other things. To me, it's like whoever's actually, as a listener, would actually go back and do the research that I've already done myself, but we've captured it on radio or video, and take a look at it and just be open-minded enough to say, wow, there's got to be something to this.
Yep. Are you there?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I thought I lost you there for a second. Yeah, absolutely, and it is, once again, it is this unstoppable presence of this thing that we can start. I think people are feeling it more and more. This growth of consciousness, and as you said, as you said earlier, right up front, you said that a few years ago you couldn't discuss this with people. Today, I mentioned this in this boardroom full of people that are from relatively wealthy backgrounds, and generally speaking, it's an area where people carry a lot of arrogance and carry a lot of ego, I suppose. And yet I was just absolutely amazed to find how completely plugged in and connected everybody is with this rise of the embracing the fact that there's this growing universal consciousness that is just spreading everywhere, and people are waking up so quickly.
Right. Yeah, if you open your eyes to it and you ask a few questions, and I mean, what's funny is one little question leads to all these variables. And I mean, it's hard to talk to one individual and say, okay, if they ask you one question, you can't answer it in one sentence. I mean, there's so many variables that you have to go into in order for that understanding to be there or to be met. Did you ever find that?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, you ask one question and, I could go on for an hour just answering that question in itself.
Right. Absolutely.
So, because we're starting to understand so many different components that all feed the substance of that particular question, or the answer to that question. And it's not very simple. Often it's quite complex.
Right.
And I was gonna tell you something more about these ruins down here and how they link to the frequencies. And what's important is to also realize that these guys didn't just build these ruins. They carved hundreds and hundreds of petroglyphs, rock carvings of these stone structures into rock that we have also photographed. And in my new book, Temples of the African Gods, I show a number of these carvings of these circles. So they were also the first architects, if you want to call them that.
Yeah.
And they didn't just carve them into rock, but many of the stone structures and the stone ruins that we've analyzed are also, first of all, they're aligned to the north, south, east, west alignments, the cardinal points. They are also, however, show very advanced knowledge of geometry and sacred geometry and understanding structure and form that is absolutely mind-blowing. And when you start realizing that they're encoded and built into these ancient stone ruins, just like the modern-day crop circles that you get in the UK and in those wheat fields,
right?
With incredibly advanced knowledge of sacred geometry and physics and so forth. Well, these guys are building it into these stone ruins, but building it in with stone, so it lasts forever.
Right.
And that's just spectacular. I mean, when you start seeing hexagons and tetrahedrons and pentagons and advanced knowledge of sacred geometry being built into stone structures, your mind just boggles.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine how, in my mind, with 3D thinking, I guess, if you will, you think of somebody with a hammer and a chisel that knocked this stuff out. And I think there had to be more to it than that, as how they created them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we spoke about their knowledge of vibration frequency and being able to levitate things and so forth. So we're not talking about a primitive Stone Age civilization with
right.
hammers, chisels, or stone tools bashing away. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people that knew way. Again, okay, you've got to draw a line, though. You've got to draw a distinction between the workers and the gods, the workers and the slave drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the workers and the bosses, whatever you want to call them, right? The bosses and the slave drivers and the gods, they had the knowledge. They knew how the tools work. They knew how the technology worked, and they gave those tools and that technology to the workers. Nothing has changed. I mean, the guys that work in the mines today, they operate the machinery underground. They press buttons. They do things. I mean, do you think those guys know why the technology works, why the machine works, how it works? who builds that machine, where it comes from? They don't. They just use the tools. They use the technology, and they get the ore out of the ground. They get it hoisted up in the lifts up to the top, and they don't know how these tools work.
Right.
Well, the same happened in the ancient times here. So you had the workers that had advanced tools, very advanced tools, but they did not build those tools. Those tools were given to them by the Anunnaki and these advanced beings that knew how to make them. And remember that the magnetron is the tool that was used by the Japanese, the magnetron and the klystron. They're the high frequency frequency generating devices that are used in what were known as the death ray that was being generated and created by the Japanese. Now, with the death ray, they were going to smite the entire Allied army just by pointing a beam at them and frying them and just completely wiping them out. And they were very close to launching that until the Americans dropped the bomb on Japan, and that brought it to a sudden and abrupt end. And the death ray was never used, but it was very close for them to use the death ray. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating, and this brings us back to the understanding of frequency, and especially high energy frequency, high energy generating devices. Now, the magnetron is about 6 inches in diameter in those death rays, if that, okay? And those would have been incredibly powerful weapons of war. Now, imagine a magnetron that's 20 meters in diameter and not just 6 inches in diameter.
Right.
Can you imagine the amount of energy that stone structure would have generated?
Right.
It is unthinkable. It's absolutely unthinkable.
Right.
Remember that Nikola Tesla discovered that the Earth rings like a bell, and that sound energy and sound frequency comes out of the Earth every square inch of planet Earth. And if you know how to use that sound frequency, you can convert it into any other form of energy. And that's pretty much what he did with his Tesla tower. And people necessarily aren't aware of that.
Right.
And I believe that he just rediscovered what the ancient civilizations here were applying in their mining of gold, utilizing the frequency from the earth, getting the energy out, using that energy by these devices that look just like the magnetron and generating very high, powerful energy, frequency energy. And they channeled that right across the entire subcontinent, and they channeled that into areas right across the subcontinent so they could utilize that energy for everything they did. Mining, crushing the ore, providing food, generating everything. And I lost my train of thought now.
Well, I'm sorry about that. While you're thinking about that, that actually brings me to something that the channels say to me as the observer a lot, is they say you don't understand energy. And once you understand energy, then, I mean, basically, if you think of everything, whether it be solid, liquid, mass, whatever, as energy, even like a rock or a living being or anything, if you picture it having a vibrational frequency or energy, and you can learn how it works, how to manipulate it for your own good, I mean, that's how miracles happen. You can do about anything.
That's exactly, Joseph, that's exactly what it is. You put your finger right on it, and I keep repeating this to people all the time. When we say energy in today's world, people think of electricity.
Right.
That's not what I'm talking about. Electricity is a lethal form of energy that kills people.
Right.
You know? We're talking about non-lethal forms of non-polar energy. We're talking about linear energy, non-polar, non-lethal energy. It's a completely different concept to what we understand energy to be today, or electricity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these guys had a completely different understanding of energy, and they use it from generating from a sound base, from sound being the original source of it. And that's what's very clear to me. And again, that was confirmed to me in my channeling. And if it was indeed Enki that I was talking to, which he said it was, then all my questions were confirmed. And I have a much clearer understanding of what was going on here.
Absolutely.
And they certainly used the sound energy from planet Earth. They used it with other sources of energy that they plugged into it. And the entire subcontinent of Southern Africa was one giant energy grid. It must have been absolutely spectacular to behold.
I agree with you. You know what? Speaking in the lines of energy, I have like a small example of energy and how it works. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Reiki energy or how the healers can actually channel whether you want to consider it a universal energy through their body, and by some people call it therapeutic touch, some people call it Reiki, but at any rate, the energy flows through you with the intent, and I always say thought becomes reality. If the person that you're working on truly wants to be healed and believes in it, and they're allowing this energy to come through them to manipulate their energy or DNA to heal in a fashion that's what they want, then, I mean, right there is how miracles happen again. I mean, and that's a manipulation of energy in a small way. And, I mean, there's a lot of, I don't want to say there's a lot of research out there, but, you know, it's been around for a long time. And with my own work, I see it working every day. And it's just amazing to me that we don't use this every day.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, this whole thing about your thoughts become reality. I mean, that's been shown many, many times.
Absolutely.
And it is one of these. It's actually, in my opinion, this is the most important ability that we need to harness and start to utilize as this evolving species that is embracing this growth of consciousness.
Absolutely.
To utilize and plug into the ability that we can use our thoughts as a creative tool to create anything we can imagine. And affect anything we can imagine. And it is there. It's just a frequency. Your thoughts are a vibrational frequency and an energy, just like the sound that I'm making with my mouth while I'm talking to you.
Yep.
There's no difference.
Well, I have an example. Like yesterday, the channel said to me that they gave me an example of how energy works. And if thought does become reality, and you put that thought out there without doubt, they said, now picture a tunnel with your thought going down this tunnel, and it's a straight shot. As soon as you put an ounce of doubt in, it's like a wall that comes up. Now all of a sudden your thought doesn't materialize because you have doubt, and there you have to chip away at it until you break through, and then off you go again. And that's, I mean, if you understand energy and law of attraction, and that's why a lot of people that stay positive have a positive vibrational energy within their inner being, and they appear to be healthier and much more satisfied with life and more understanding, and they're not so apt to go into war, and and I think it has something to do with love vibrational energy as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, I would agree with you totally there, Joe. I'm just looking at the time. It looks like we got about 10 minutes left.
Right.
But what I'd like to do, if I can, is bring up the subject of my research with contributionism and what I refer to as the new social structure, which I'm trying to spread to the rest of the world.
Perfect.
Because I think it's important in this crazy world of misery and hardships and financial destruction of people's lives and a lot of sadness and unhappiness. The planet is not a happy place, and I think if you've studied the work of Bruce Lipton, it's very obvious that the planet is under stress. The entire planet as a living organism is under stress, and the people and even the animals and the plants and all beings on this planet are under stress.
Right.
And it's all to do with what's being developed and created by the human race and the slave masters that have enslaved our species. Now, it doesn't seem to be a light or a happy ending to this nightmare that we're trapped in. And I've been working on this for the last 4.5 years, nearly 5 years, and it's really an answer, and I believe a golden bright light at the end of the tunnel, and a real answer for a happy ending to this terrible crisis that hopefully will come to an end with a giant solar flare or something like that. But it's important for us to have a blueprint or a theory, at least, of how to survive if we suddenly have to go back to the Stone Age in a few seconds. Because we need to move on. We need to move on with technology and develop technology and grow as a community and grow as a spiritual group of beings. And I call this thing contributionism. It's really a social structure that works on a system without money. Now, we all have been saying this for how many years and hundreds of years, that money is the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil, is the cause of all problems, and you know what? It gets worse. It just gets worse and worse. And all our entire lives and every single person on this planet is a slave to the financial system, is a slave to money. And from the first breath we take to the last breath we breathe out, every one of us is in some way or another enslaved to the monetary system. And it's just wrong. That's not why we're born. That's not why we're here.
Right.
And yet most people, not most, yet, well, I suppose most, yes, most people believe that somehow money is part of an evolutionary process, and we ended up with money because that's how things are supposed to be. Well, that's not true. That is the farthest thing from the truth that you can probably find, because money was introduced as a source of enslavement by a small group of royal political elite, a bunch of bastards a long time ago, that wanted to enslave the people even more.
Yep.
And through money, they created this absolute control, and they're really riding shotgun, and they're tightening the noose on an annual basis, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So if you're going to try and solve the problem, the obvious thing is to remove money. There's only one way to go. If you remove money, suddenly everything changes. And one of the first casualties of money is that crime goes. Suddenly, if there's no money in the system, crime just suddenly disappears. So I call it contributionism, and it's really it's a model for a post-apocalyptic social world order that functions without money. It's a very spiritual concept. It's a concept based on the growth of consciousness and unity. It's based on the understanding that we all need to contribute our naturally gifted, naturally given talents and gifts for the greater benefit of our community and our immediate society. And there is no money. It's a system that works without the concept of attaching value to anything, and also a system without the concept of barter or trade, because barter and trade is just another way of capitalism and control. He who has more to barter will eventually control everything else. So, and what happens when you start analyzing this and you start thinking about this, it takes a while, because our brains are so programmed with the capitalistic and the consumerist principles that it sometimes, some people struggle with it. Some people get it immediately. They go, oh, I got it, I understand it, thank you very much, where can I sign up, kind of thing.
Right.
While other people really struggle with it. And quite frankly, the wealthy people and the people with a lot of stuff, a lot of earthly possessions, are the biggest potential obstacle to contributionism. What it does do, it turns the pyramid principle of the capitalist system, because after all, the world as we know it today is just one giant pyramid scheme, right? Really, the capitalist system is just one giant pyramid scheme, and everyone's trying to get to the top and control the rest. And it doesn't have a happy ending unless you take the pyramid and you turn it upside down. And that's really what contribution is all about, where everything that previously was deemed to be not financially viable, and you can imagine the millions and millions and millions of people that are in miserable jobs, they hate their lives, they hate the fact that they have to get up and catch the train or catch the bus or walk in the rain or drive in the traffic and get to their work, and their boss craps on their head because they were late or they didn't do this, and they really hate their job, but they have to keep the job because they have to pay the bills. Right. Now imagine if all this energy that's wasted by these billions of people gets introduced and put into something that those people love to do. Can you imagine what the global consciousness and the global flow of energy will do to the planet, and how quickly it will heal these terrible wounds and the emotional scars and the stress that the planet is under? It's quite spectacular. So, in my opinion, one of the most evil things that anyone can chant or utter and mostly it comes from your bank manager when you try and go and get a loan for a new business venture, is sorry, but it is not economically viable, right? So you can imagine if there are suddenly, 3 billion people on planet Earth that as of tomorrow morning are suddenly doing things that they love. They're naturally gifted and they know how to do it, and they do it with love and passion as their contribution to their society. So what I'm saying to you is that we're not going to force, and the contributionist model doesn't want to force people to grow vegetables in their back garden and be so self-sustainable. No. That is where I believe everybody goes wrong. And they think, we must go and plant our own veggie garden and, have our own water source and be ready. And no, that's a lager mentality, locking yourself in. You can't force a rocket scientist to grow vegetables. Rocket scientists must build rockets. And, farmers must grow food. And shoemakers must make shoes, and civil engineers must build cities, and so forth. You've got to let people do what they're naturally gifted and what they love to do. But it is a very, very beautiful structure. It works. I've worked on it for nearly 5 years now, and I've had to go through every possible scenario. Like, how does the legal system work in contributionism? What happens to education? What happens to children? What happens to technology? What happens to space travel? What happens to television shows? What happens to sport? What happens to politics? And I've had to go and break down each and every one of these components. And the answer to you is it works like clockwork. It is so simple. It is spectacular. And the most exciting thing is that it is a source of abundance. The abundance in contributionism is absolutely mind-blowing. Abundance of everything. Abundance of food, of growth, of technology and science and exploration, and the growth, the exponential growth in everything you can imagine. It just explodes because nobody has the need to hold on to some knowledge or information because they want to try and squeeze every buck out of it they can.
Right. So basically, if you go back to simplicity and community, that's part of the premise that you're speaking of, right?
Yeah, it is. Contributionism works best in reasonably small communities. Mm-hmm. I believe that is where it can start. For example, the small town that I live in, I'm trying to turn that into a contributionist society and a contributionist town. And I believe once the first town goes, the rest of the country will follow very, very quickly. Awesome. Because when they realize that everything there is for free, and this entire town, the people live there and they have everything for free. They don't have to pay for anything, and they have this absolute abundance. You can imagine how all the other towns will respond.
Great. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I want to thank you for being on the show. We'd love to have you back in the future. And is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. It was lovely chatting to you, and it's nice to know that you have a nice captive audience that are broad-minded and clear-thinking individuals. It's fantastic, and I believe this is spreading worldwide very quickly. I'd just like to leave your listeners with, please go to my website, especially zuluplanet.com. Help Credo Mutwa, who's really in dire straits, buy his DVD. You'll be amazed to find out the information that he shares with you. And it'll also help us with the research into the ancient ruins and help me to continue doing my research and my work. Thanks very much.
Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much. I suppose I could say by the fact that I'm really very fortunate to be living in Southern Africa, especially South Africa at this point in time. And after writing Slave Species of God in 2006, my journey of discovery and exploration into the origins of humankind has taken me down some very interesting paths and led me to meet a chap called Johann Heine, who made the phenomenal discovery of Adam's calendar, which, at that stage it didn't have a name. It was just a calendar site. But basically, the fact that I wrote a book called Slave Species of God allowed me to then move into further discovery and and research and meet some amazing individuals here in South Africa that have been making observations for a long time of mysterious ancient stone circular structures and ruins that have been missed and completely misinterpreted by historians and archaeologists, and allowed us to go in there and reevaluate and reassess their importance and significance in human history, only to discover that we're dealing with what we now believe is the first civilization on Earth, and the first time that we actually present the physical evidence of this first civilization, this vanished civilization that lived at the bottom southern tip of Africa, mining gold. And this would be the civilization that people like Zecharia Sitchin and many others have been writing about and referring to in their translations of the Sumerian tablets. And I suppose I'm very fortunate that we are now dealing with these vast numbers of ancient stone ruins that take us back just short of 300,000 years, and exposing this ancient civilization that just suddenly and mysteriously vanished around 13,000 years ago. And that's what we're dealing with at the moment, and I suppose I'm working on that on a daily basis.
Wow. So do you find much opposition from like mainstay science when you try to present this case?
Not really. That's the interesting thing. I've got to first distinguish between science and archaeology. And I need to do this because I think it's important just to put things into perspective. Scientists as a whole, physicists, astrophysicists, chemists, geologists, people who studied scientific principles or have some sort of a scientific background have absolutely no problem with any of these discoveries. In fact, they're the guys that are really supporting my work on all kinds of possible levels, even astrophysicists and nuclear physicists and some of the leading experts in their field here in South Africa. Where the opposition comes from is from the archaeological fraternity. And I must quickly haste to say that archaeology sort of falls between the cracks, and it's not really regarded as a scientific principle. We're not quite sure where to put it, or not we, I suppose the establishment. At the source and the beginning of every religion, there is always the presence of these so-called gods.
Right.
And you've got to start breaking and separating our understanding of God with a big G, the divine being, the divine creative spirit, the divine creative source and energy for all the things in the universe, and just advanced beings who declare themselves gods above the humans because they could fly in machines and genetically manipulate species. And so there's a big difference between God with a big G and God with a small G, and we should never ever confuse the two.
Right. Okay, so do you want to go into the various books that you've written or a website that you'd like to tell the listeners? Like, how can they find more about you?
Look, there are a number of websites. The first website would be slavespecies.com. And you can also subscribe to my newsletters there. I write the regular articles that go out to people that subscribe, and I try and keep up with the latest discoveries and link it to this, what I call the great human puzzle. And then there's also zuluplanet.com. That's ZULU planet, zuluplanet.com. And then also the website for our foundation, the foundation that we created in 2003 to protect and preserve these ancient stone ruins in South Africa, and hopefully preserve them for sharing this information and being able to show them off to tourists and people that come visit. And that is the Makomati Foundation, and that's MAKOMATI.org, makomati.org.
Great. So how long would you say you've been doing this type of work?
Joe, I've been interested in the origins of humankind since very early in my life, in my early teens and even before that. I was just fascinated by these mythological stories of these these all-powerful gods that were present on Earth in ancient times, that were flying around in these incredible machines, that could do all these amazing things, and they were all part of this big family, and they had complete control of the earthlings, and I was absolutely fascinated by that. And at that stage I was a young aspiring musician, and I would write songs about every single one of these mythological gods, from Zeus to Mercury to Beelzebub to Pluto to you name it. I wrote songs about these characters, and I suppose that's why I started really being interested in what on earth was going on all these thousands of years ago on planet Earth. And what I need to share with your audience is this whole thing of mythology. It's very important to break down some of these words and these terminologies that we use every now and then. Well, actually, that we use all the time, every day, like the word mythology. For example, the origin of the word mythology comes from Greek, mythos, and in the original meaning, it means completely the opposite to the value that we ascribe to it today. Today, we believe that mythological means imaginary fairy tales. Well-known, recognized, and revered writers and historians talk about Atlantis and so forth. And then we come along and say, no, these guys are talking rubbish. They were taking too many drugs or getting drunk or something like that,
Right.
Because we can't understand how all this ancient stuff could have happened, and yet we don't know about it today.
Right.
And it's our arrogance and our ego that keeps kicking in, and we think we're so smart because we believe we're the pinnacle of civilization,
right,
and knowledge and sophistication just because we've got cell phones or something stupid like that. It's just absolutely pathetic, and we've got to wake up, smell the coffee, and realize that things were completely different in years gone by, that there's a history on this planet that is so removed from our ability to try and actually grasp it, that we need to wipe the slate clean and realize we need to start from scratch and start to absorb and put together the pieces of the puzzle that has been completely distorted by history and those that wrote our history books. I just did a full-day workshop. I mean, I'm standing here, I'm drinking coffee to stay awake because I've just come back from doing a full-day workshop, so I'm about to keel over. But it's exciting just to plug back into this thing that I've just spent the whole day taking people through, because it's so important to wrap your head around this, okay?
Right.
Because if you think that we know a lot about our human history, you'd be completely mistaken. All you have to do is realize that every time there's a global conflict or some sort of a conflict, we lose a huge amount of knowledge in history. And we use this phrase, history is written by the victors, right? Everyone throws that out all the time. Well, history books are written by the victors.
Right.
Well, yes, they are. But what does it actually mean? Well, it means that our history books and our perception of history that have been written by the victors has a profound effect on how much we actually know about our human history. What it tells us is that we know absolutely nothing about those people that were conquered, or those people that were destroyed. What do we know about the thousands and thousands of villages and towns and places and the millions of people that were destroyed by Alexander the Great and his armies? We know absolutely nothing about them.
Right.
But we know everything about Alexander the Great and how great he was. Well, he was no better than Hitler. He just invaded armies, enslaved the people, destroyed everything, and then he was declared the Great, Alexander the Great. Well, I'm not so sure about that. So just to give you an example how little we actually know about history, all you have to do is do a little mathematical study, and you realize that if we lose 50% of the information during a conflict situation, then it only takes about 8 conflict situations for us to know less than 1% of the original truth. And if you carry on, you very quickly realize that it is absolutely spectacular how little we actually know about the original truth.
Right. So I'm sure the listeners are wondering, what findings or what have you found there in Africa? Have you found anything like the giant skeletons of previous humans or anything like that?
Well,
at the moment, we haven't found any human remains. That is the one big mystery. Personally, to me, it's not really surprising because
I'm just not quite sure where to put it. So I'd like to separate the scientists from the archaeologists and leave it as that. The archaeologists are the guys that are really struggling with some of the discoveries. They seem to live in textbooks, and they don't want to get out of the textbooks. Yeah.
I see. So what is your perspective of human existence or evolution now that you've been enlightened, per se?
Well, Joe, the situation is really straightforward. I mean, there are those scholars and academics who are prepared to break the mold and come out and share their findings and tell it like it is, and then there are those that are too scared to call it as it is because they're scared to lose their job, they're scared of being ridiculed by their peers, and they're just fearful. Fortunately, I don't fall into any kind of institutional fold, and I can say what I need to say as I discover it, and I'm not guided by any of these principles. So I'm lucky as far as that goes. I'm a completely independent researcher and scientist, and my observations are very simple. There's overwhelming evidence that the human race is a product of some cloning or genetic manipulation of something of that nature, that we suddenly appeared on planet Earth about 300,000 years ago as a result of this cloning and manipulation, genetic manipulation. And there was a very simple reason why we appeared on this Earth. We were created as a slave species to some higher, more advanced beings to mine gold. And planet Earth has been a mining colony for a long time. It remains a mining colony today, and that's what it started like. And the evidence for this genetic manipulation far outweighs any other evidence of the so-called theory of evolution. Okay, and this is where the two areas cross over quite comfortably, because there's plenty of evidence for evolution when we look at plant species, when we look at other animals and things around us. But at the same time, there is absolutely overwhelming evidence that there is something wrong with our DNA. And the fact that we only use 3% of our DNA, less than any other species on this planet, speaks volumes of the fact that we're supposed to be the most advanced and civilized creature on this planet, and yet we use so little of our DNA. Something is wrong with that model. It doesn't quite fit. Oh. So that's where my belief structure lies at the moment.
Okay. So how do you think that this would change the various religions in the world if this came out as kind of like the smoking gun per se, and it actually proved what you say?
Well, you've got to go back and look where the origins of religions are. And origins of religions, if you actually go back, and this is what I show in my first book, Slave Species of God, every single religion on earth has its origins in ancient civilizations and goes back and can be traced back to the same group of so-called gods, these mythological gods that were present on planet Earth for many thousands of years and manipulated and enslaved the people for a very long time. And every religion comes from the same, exactly the same stories, etc. Well, that is not true. Actually, the original meaning of mythos was words, written words and spoken words of historic events that were sworn to be true by priests and kings. So suddenly you see what happens is that we take what ancient civilizations saw as absolutely part and parcel of their history and irrefutable, deniable facts, and we completely distort its meaning. Because today, when you say mythological, everybody thinks imaginary and so forth.
Right.
So what I'd like to tell your listeners is to say, next time you read the word mythological, just replace it with the word historical, because that's what it is, and suddenly you realize that our human history looks completely different. And that's an exciting discovery to make. Remember that these stories of these mythological creatures don't just come from, Greece and Egypt and so forth, but we read about the same group of gods in the Sumerian tablets, the oldest written record of human history we have on Earth. And in these Sumerian tablets, we read about these gods that came to Earth and created the earthlings in their own image to work as slaves in the gold mines. And that exact same story gets repeated in every ancient civilization and culture. In the Zulu culture, the South African Bantu tribal, the indigenous people, the Zulu people culture, they talk about the Abalungu, the white sky gods that came down from the sky and created the black people, or the African people, should I say, because they weren't black at that stage. The Sumerian tablets describes them very clearly as to what the first earthlings looked like. They were quite reddish in their appearance and their skin. And so the white sky gods came out of the sky and created the earthlings to work in the gold mines. And this is not something that you make up and throw out freely, because you'd be classed as a racist quite easily. But this isn't something I'll make up. This is something that's well entrenched in African tradition, African religion, and African customs, ancient customs. And we need to start embracing this information and stop shoving it under the carpet and turning a blind eye to this.
Right. So things such as Atlantis, I mean, I know a lot of the listeners have heard of Atlantis. So just for an example, I mean, that's considered to be mythical. What are your views on that in that era of human history?
Atlantis was most certainly not a mythical place. Atlantis definitely existed. There's no question about that. We're seeing strange geophysical phenomena going on today on planet Earth. I mean, we see tsunamis come and go, wiping out coastlines, coastal cities, taking out small islands. And these are just tiny, tiny little tsunamis, right? This is not major geophysical disasters. Now imagine a flood so vast that it covered the entire world with a wave several kilometers or several miles high. It's not something we can imagine. It's just way outside of our spectrum of imaginary ability at the moment.
Right.
So Atlantis is something that's written about in all ancient civilizations. I mean, they talk about this place. The ancient Greeks and ancient